In this video, we'll discuss how a Canadian oil cutoff would be a bigger shock to the US than you can ever imagine, and why it's nearly impossible to replace Canadian oil, and why the US can't even use most of the oil it produces. We'll break down the effects of this energy war and why the US can't solve it with money, and what options Canada has to minimize its losses and find new trade partners. Now this video is only about energy sector. There has been a lot of political noise around tariffs and trade wars, but most of it is just individual politicians throwing out ideas. But what actually matters here is the energy supply chain, its economic impact, and whether the two countries have any real solutions. And that's exactly what we are breaking down. You're watching Catalyst, let's get started. You wake up, you check your phone and see the headlines. Canada threatens to cut off oil exports to the US. At first, it sounds like some political drama, just another round of trade tensions between two allies. Then suddenly the reality sets in. This isn't just about any commodity. This is oil, the lifeblood of the modern economy. And Canada? It's not just a supplier, it's the supplier. Almost 97% of Canada's total oil exports goes straight to the US. We are talking about 4 million barrels per day, flowing into the American refineries, fueling industries and keeping energy prices stable. Now without it, the US doesn't just lose a supplier, it loses its biggest, most reliable source of crude. And replacing it? That's not as easy as it sounds. You see, it's not a one-way street that Canada is dependent on the US. It's the other way around too. The US is also heavily dependent on Canada, specifically in terms of oil. It buys nearly all the oil Alberta produces. Now a lot of people think that US could just buy oil from somewhere else. But here's the problem. Not all oil is the same. American refineries are built around Canadian heavy oil. Switching to a different source isn't just like changing a gas station. It's a month-long, multi-billion-dollar adjustment that disrupts the entire industries. And while the US has money, supply problems aren't solved overnight. Remember 2022? When a major geopolitical event threw global energy market into chaos? Price spiked, industries suffered, and governments scrambled to stabilize supplies. A Canadian oil cutoff could trigger the same kind of crisis, except this time, it's happening right at America's doorstep. But even if the US wanted to replace Canadian crude, there aren't many alternatives. Heavy crude is produced only by a few countries. Let's have a look at that. So these are the countries which produce heavy oil. And now here it's get a bit tricky. US sanctions has effectively blocked imports from Venezuela, so it's off the table. Next is Mexico, a supplier, but the production has been declining for years. Next is Iraq. It exports heavy crude, but not nearly enough to replace Canada. And the last one is Asia, geographically out of the question for cost-effective transports. In short, there is no quick fix. Changing suppliers would take years, requiring new contracts, logistics, and infrastructure changes. This puts the US at a major disadvantage, vulnerable to supply shocks, refinery slowdowns, and a full-blown energy crisis. Now many of you might think that the US produces a lot of oil, and yes, that is right. At first glance, it's easy to see that the US is the biggest oil producer in the entire world, more than Saudi Arabia or Russia. Which brings me to the next point. Why the US can't use the oil it produces. As you know by now that Canada produces 4 million barrels per day and sends them over to the US, and the US produces about 12 million barrels per day of its own oil. Shouldn't that be enough to make up the difference? Now here's the problem. Most of that oil isn't usable inside the US. Make no mistake, the crude produced in states like Texas and North Dakota is the expensive light oil. Thin, low density, and great for making gasoline. But US refineries, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, aren't built for that kind of oil. They were designed decades ago to handle heavy crude, the same type that comes from Canada's oil sands. Now you might be wondering that why didn't they just build facilities for light oil? But before answering that question, you have to understand that the US must import heavy crude from other countries just to keep its own refineries running efficiently. And why is that important? Because if the US refineries can't get enough of that heavy crude they're built for, they slow down. Or worse, shut down. Now these refineries aren't like factories that can simply scale down production when supply drops. A refinery that isn't operating at full capacity becomes inefficient, losing millions of dollars per day in operating cost. If supply disruptions last too long, some facilities may be forced to close entirely. And when refineries shut down, it's not just an industry problem, it's a consumer problem. Fewer refineries operating means higher gas prices at the pump, not by cent, but by dollars per gallon. In 2019, a single refinery explosion in Pennsylvania caused gas prices to spike by 25 cents per gallon in just days. A national-scale supply disruption could push prices up by $1.5 to $2 per gallon. Not only that, it can also cause severe shortage of diesel and jet fuel, impacting trucking, shipping, and airline prices. The ripple effect of this across local economy, especially in areas where refineries are major employers, is devastating. The 2019 Philadelphia refinery closure led to over 1,000 immediate job losses and a $4.25 billion economic loss to the region. And that's just one refinery being closed. Think about states like Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois, where entire towns depend on refinery jobs. If those plants can't operate, thousands of workers are out of job. Businesses will suffer and local economies will spiral into decline. With refineries struggling to operate, it raises the obvious question: why not just upgrade them to refined light oil, which is produced in the US? But as it turns out, that's a problem of its own. The simple answer for this is financial issues. Reconfiguring refineries to process more domestic light oil would cost billions of dollars per facility, take years to complete, and disrupt fuel supplies during the transition. And that's not just a logistical nightmare, it's an economic dead end. As I explained in the last point, just one facility being closed can cause billions of damage to the economy. And this upgrade of refineries will take years, if not decades. For reference, a single refinery conversion project in the US can cost between $2 to $5 billion, and that's just for one facility. The entire US refining sector would need hundreds of billions to shift away from Canadian crude. That's money companies won't spend when it's far cheaper to import oil instead. Canadian crude, even the transport costs, is economically viable because refineries are already designed to handle it. Upgrading would mean taking facilities offline for extended periods, during which fuel prices would spike even higher. This is why US oil companies continue to buy foreign crude, even while exporting their own light oil abroad. So if Canadian oil suddenly disappeared, the US wouldn't just be dealing with a supply shortage, it would be dealing with a structural crisis in its refining sector, which supports over 3 million jobs and generates more than $400 billion in economic activity every year. The path ahead for Canada wouldn't be easy either. A sudden oil cutoff would disrupt supply chains, hurt industries, and create uncertainty in the market. But as you know, the bigger the name, the worse the fall. And for the US, that fall would hit where it hurts the most: its energy sector. The US wouldn't just take a hit, it would be wounded badly. Supply shortages, refinery shutdowns, and energy inflation would ripple across the entire economy. Meanwhile, Canada won't walk away unscathed. but it can control the damage in the short term and completely reshape its energy strategy in the long run. Unlike the US, which is trapped in the need for heavy crude, Canada has leverage. It can redirect its oil elsewhere, and there is no shortage of buyers. Asia is the biggest energy market, and with Europe still searching for stable energy suppliers, Canada has more paths forward than the US does. This isn't just about oil, it's about who can adapt faster. And right now, Canada holds the advantage, while the US is left scrambling for solutions.